Thanks so much to the organizers for putting together this fantastic conference, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to talk about social network data and the dependence underlying this kind of data and problems that can engender for statistical analysis and inference. So this is a picture of a social network. When I talk about network data in this talk, what I have in mind is that from each node or each person in the network, we have observed some variables, covariates, treatments or exposures, outcomes. I don't mean data about the network structure, which is what network data often means. This particular network was created using Framingham Heart Study data, and I'll come back to describe the Framingham Heart Study in a little bit. When subjects in a study are connected to one another by social network ties, as they are in Framingham Heart Study, it can engender dependence. Their data can exhibit statistical dependence, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'll use the Framingham Heart Study as a running example and tell you a bit about that study first. Then I'll explain two things that can go wrong when researchers analyze data without fully accounting for the dependence in the data. The first is anticonservative statistical inference, and the second is spurious associations. And I'll explain what I mean by those terms when I get to that. Then I'll talk about a test for dependence that my fantastic former student, Eugen Lee, developed that can provide circumstantial evidence for when these two problems might occur. And I'll tell you about what happened when we applied this test to several highly cited published papers that use Framingham Heart Study data. And finally, I'll describe how I reanalyzed one particular Framingham Heart Study paper's analysis, and in the reanalysis, I accounted for dependence. The original analysis had not accounted for dependence, and in the reanalysis, we found no evidence of the strong effects that the original paper had purported to find. The Framingham Heart Study is an ongoing cohort study that was initiated over 70 years ago. It's one of the most influential modern epidemiologic studies, and it's arguably the most important source of epidemiologic data on cardiovascular disease. Thousands of publications on cardiovascular disease and other types of health outcomes have used Framingham Heart Study data, and they continue to be published. Hundreds of new papers are published using these data every year. And just about all of these papers, all of the papers that are not explicitly about genetic relatedness in the Framingham Heart Study cohort, all of the papers use IID statistical methods. IID means independent and identically distributed. So all of the papers published using these data assume that the subjects are independent. But when you look at who's in this cohort, you see that they're really interconnected with one another. So the subjects in the Framingham Heart Study comprise a significant portion of the residents of a relatively small suburb of Boston in Massachusetts, the city of Framingham. The subjects are neighbors and friends and coworkers with one another, and they're related to one another. There are about 1,500 extended families that have at least 3 members participating in the study. This makes Framingham Heart Study a perfect, though probably not unique, example of a convenience sample that's comprised of members of an interconnected network rather than independent subjects. So Framingham Heart Study might be especially interconnected, but convenience samples that tap into social networks are actually very common in the health and social sciences. For example, psychology studies that recruit undergrads from a single university, education studies that recruit subjects from one or a small number of schools, medical studies that recruit subjects from one or a small number of hospitals, and any study that recruits subjects from one or a small number of communities could fall into this category. And these convenience samples are always analyzed using, again, these IID methods that assume that the subjects are independent. So what I hope to convince you of today is that ignoring the dependence in this kind of convenience sample can lead to the publication of spurious results, and that this could be an important cause of the replication crisis. But in all of the soul searching about the replication crisis in psychology, social science, public health, medicine, the role of inadequately handled statistical dependence has been pretty much entirely overlooked. The Framingham Heart Study also plays a really important role in the study of causal effects in social network data, specifically peer effects, or the causal effect that one person can have on their social contacts. In the early 2000s, Nicholas Christakis, a sociologist, and James Fowler, political scientist, realized that buried in the Framingham Heart Study data, which again is a cardiovascular disease epidemiology study, but buried in the data, there's a ton of information about social ties, about who's related to whom, who's friends with whom, who works with whom, who lives near whom. So Christakis and Fowler harnessed this information to create the network picture that I showed. They looked into the records and put together a picture of who's connected to whom in order to be able to create that network. And then they published a series of extremely influential and highly publicized papers looking for evidence of peer effects for lots of different outcomes in the Framingham Heart Study data. And this initiated a lot of interest in using similar methods to estimate peer effects in social network data, both using the Framingham Heart Study social network and other non-experimental social network data sets. Over the years since these papers started coming out, statisticians have criticized the methods for a variety of issues. But the problem that I'm most interested in has received very little attention so far, and that's the fact that the methods used in all of these papers to learn about peer effects assume, again, that the data are independent. And this is despite the fact that peer effects are themselves a form of social network dependence. So most of what I'm going to talk about comes from this paper that was led by my former student, Yu Jim. And first, let me explain why it's a problem to treat data as if they're independent, to use methods, statistical methods that assume data are independent, when in fact there's some dependence in the data. So first off, failure to account for dependence in your data is a problem for uncertainty quantification. Statisticians use standard errors and confidence intervals to quantify the statistical uncertainty around an estimate. And p-values are also, in some sense, a measure of this uncertainty because the p-value of an estimate depends on the estimate standard error. We say that a method is conservative if you overestimate the uncertainty, and this is generally a desirable property. This protects against type 1 errors, which are claiming that an estimate is statistically significant when you shouldn't make that claim. Any intermediate level course in statistics will teach you that ignoring most kinds of dependence will lead to underestimating uncertainty, and this is anti-conservative inference. When you underestimate uncertainty, you're too confident in your results, and so you might publish claims of significant effects that might not actually warrant that label. And of course, if an effect should not be called significant and you publish it as if it is, then it may not replicate as expected. So even though this is a really known statistical fact in the abstract, it's not that widely known in applied statistics, and it hasn't really been connected to the replication crisis in any widespread way. And I hope that I'll convince you that it's something that applied researchers need to be more worried about. And in fact, those of us who work on statistical methods need to be more worried about it as well. So that's anti-conservative inference, and it can affect any kind of estimation. If we're specifically interested in estimating the association or a correlation or a causal effect between two variables, let's say x and y, and if both x and y exhibit similar patterns of dependence, then even if x is independent of y, if we fail to account for the dependence within x across network nodes and within y across network nodes, then the dependence can give rise to spurious association estimates. This means estimates that are concentrated away from the true value. Okay, so let's dig into these two problems and try to understand exactly why they occur. So first, I'll explain the problem of anti-conservative inference. Why does ignoring dependence lead to underestimating the uncertainty in an estimate? Suppose we want to estimate a simple mean, like the average height of people living in the Boston suburbs. And we'll use the sample average of height measurements from the Framingham Heart Study as our estimator. If you've ever taken a statistics class, you'll probably know this formula. The variance of a sample average is sigma squared, which is the variance of a single observation, divided by n, which is the number of observations in our sample. So in this case, it would be sigma squared, the variance of height in the Framingham Heart Study, divided by n, the number of people in the Framingham Heart Study. Well, what if we use sigma squared divided by n as our variance estimator when, in fact, the data are dependent? The true variance is in this last line here, and the red term is what's missing from the standard variance estimator that assumes the data are IID. It's the pairwise covariances for heights among everybody in the Framingham Heart Study. And whenever this term in red is positive, the true variance will be greater than the variance that assumes the data are independent. And that's the estimate, again, that you would use if you weren't worried about dependence. So ignoring the dependence underestimates the variance of an estimator. One way to think about what's happening here is that we use the variance of an estimator to quantify how much information the estimator has about the parameter we're trying to learn about. So the amount of information that we have in data is related to the sample size, the number of observations in the data. The larger the sample size, the more information we have. Typically, we think that each new data point brings one new bit of information to our estimator. But if data are dependent, then in fact, each new observation is bringing some new information, but not a full bit, because some of the information in that new observation is redundant due to the dependence. So each new data point is bringing less than one new bit of information. This is related to the effective sample size of a dependent data sample, which is less than n, the number of observations, because we have less information about what we're interested in estimating from a dependent sample than we would if we had the same number of observations, but they were independent. So I just explained why ignoring dependence can lead to anti-conservative inference, that is, to confidence intervals that are too narrow, p-values that are too small. Now let's turn to spurious associations. Suppose we're interested in the association between some variable x and some other variable y. If there's network dependence in the x's, and there's also network dependence in the y's, then there can appear to be an association between x and y, even when x is independent of y. So as a toy example, let's say that x is height in the Framingham Heart Study, and y is political orientation in the Framingham Heart Study. Spurious associations arise because two people with similar x's are more likely to be close in the network. So if x is height, two people who have similar heights might be more likely than a random sample of two people to be familially related, genetically related in Framingham Heart Study. So similar x's means you're more likely to be close in network distance, and being close in network distance means that you're more likely to have similar y's. So people who are connected in the social network are more likely to share the same political views. But that doesn't mean that height is related to political views. It's totally an artifact of the dependence. So in an analysis, it might look like, for example, being tall is related to being progressive, but this is only an artifact of the statistical dependence. And if you go to a new network, we might expect again that height and political orientation would appear to be associated, but the direction could be totally flipped. So in a new network, it's just as likely that being tall will be associated with being conservative instead of being progressive. This kind of problem of spurious associations due to a shared dependent structure that's similar within the x's as it is within the y's is really well known in the literature on time series, where it's known as spurious correlations or sometimes nonsense or volatile correlations. And I think this is also really similar to a phenomenon known as confounding by batch effects or confounding by population structure in computational biology and in statistical genetics. Even though these phenomena are called confounding, I would claim that what's really happening there is spurious associations due to dependence. But even though these spurious associations can arise whenever data are dependent, it doesn't matter whether it's time series or spatial or genetic or network dependence, this phenomenon hasn't really been discussed in a general way outside of the time series or the comp bio literature, as far as I'm aware. And just like anti-conservative inference, spurious associations could contribute to the replication crisis. If I wrote a paper claiming strong evidence from Framingham Heart study that being tall predicts being progressive, this would very likely fail to replicate. So to illustrate in simulations, these are histograms of a correlation coefficient for two variables, x and y, where Eugen again simulated x to have network dependence and y to have network dependence, but in all of these simulations, x is independent of y, so that means the correlation should be 0. In this first blue plot, the data were actually IID, there's no network dependence, and you can see the correlation coefficient is really tightly clustered around 0. As we introduce more dependence, that tight bell curve around 0 spreads out, and at first it looks like maybe this is just a problem of increased variability, the problem that I described when I was talking about anti-conservative inference. But the real hallmark of spurious correlations is that when you introduce enough dependence, you get the picture in this last plot, plot D, where you can see the correlation coefficients are concentrating away from 0. They're not just more spread out but peaked at 0, they're actually concentrating at the extreme values of 1 and -1. Okay, so at this point, I hope I've convinced you that treating dependent data as if they're independent can lead to drawing spurious conclusions, publishing spurious results, which might then fail to replicate. But this leaves open the question, are data from convenience samples like the Framingham Heart study actually dependent in a way that could be problematic? So just because people are connected by social network ties doesn't mean that there's strong or problematic dependence. It also doesn't mean that every variable that we might be interested in would exhibit dependence. So to try to get a little closer to what we really care about, which is how problematic is this for real data analyses, Eugen developed a test for network dependence that's based on Moran's I, which is a really popular test statistic for spatial dependence. We then applied this test to 6 published papers that used the Framingham Heart study data. For each paper, we first reproduced the analysis in the original paper. Then we tested for dependence in the regression residuals. So if you've taken a regression course, you may remember that the errors or the randomness around the fitted regression line are supposed to be independent. And if we find evidence of dependence instead in those residuals, we interpret this as circumstantial evidence that inference that relies on the assumption of independence might be anti-conservative. We also tested for dependence in the primary predictor or exposure of interest and in the outcome of interest. And if we found evidence of dependence in both the exposure and the outcome, then we took this as circumstantial evidence that the analysis could suffer from spurious associations. I'm saying circumstantial evidence because we really don't have a good way of linking finding evidence of dependence to just how wrong results in the published literature could be. So these are just, this finding evidence of dependence suggests it was wrong to use models that assume the data are IID, but it doesn't tell you whether the conclusions themselves are incorrect. So first I'll tell you about 5 papers from the medical and epidemiology literature. So Eugen did a Google Scholar search and essentially picked the first 5 hits that were reproducible, meaning we could figure out from the text what analysis the authors ran, and the analysis relied largely on the publicly available portion of Framingham Heart Study data. And what we found really surprised us. We expected to find some, but not overwhelming evidence of dependence. And in fact, we found extremely strong evidence of dependence in every analysis from 2 of these papers, the Lauer et al. And Suchi et al. Papers. And in the other 3 papers, we found a mix of evidence of dependence in some of the analyses and inconclusive evidence in some of the analyses. So in none of these 5 papers did we fail to find any evidence of dependence, and that was really surprising. Obviously, this is a tiny fraction of Framingham Heart Study papers, but it suggests that much of the research coming out of Framingham Heart Study could be misapplying models that assume independence to dependent data. And this, again, suggests that it's possible that results could suffer from artificially inflated certainty, meaning artificially small confidence intervals and p-values, and also spurious associations. But again, I just want to give the strong caveat that this is only circumstantial evidence that the actual results themselves could be spurious. Then we took the paper that arguably launched a movement of interest in studying peer effects using network data. This paper purported to find evidence of peer effects or social contagion for obesity. So to assess whether there are peer effects for obesity, the authors ran pairwise alter ego regressions. The ego is the person who furnishes the outcome for the regression. It's the person whose obesity we want to explain. And the alter is one of their social connections. So every directed edge in a network corresponds to one alter ego pair. These regressions, which have 1 entry per edge, regress an ego's obesity indicator at time t on their alter's obesity status at time t-1. And they control for both the alter and the ego's past obesity and for baseline covariates. What's most important to note here is that each alter ego pair in the regression is assumed to have independent errors. So this assumes that each edge in the network is independent, even though the same node can be the ego in multiple pairs, and even though the data comprise multiple extended families. So there's strong scientific reasons to suspect that the errors might not actually be independent here. And sure enough, when Eugen ran her tests of dependence, she found very strong evidence of dependence in the exposure, the outcome, and in the regression residuals. In a different project, my colleagues and I developed a method to estimate causal effects using non-experimental social network data that accounts for some of the dependence that we would expect to see in a network, although this method is by no means fully general to all of the different types of dependence we could see in networks. And when we reanalyzed the Framingham Heart Study data to look for peer effects of obesity using these new methods, we found no evidence of peer effects. So the first thing that we did was to reframe the question. Instead of treating each alter ego pair as a separate line in the regression, we came up with a version of peer effects that can be defined simultaneously for all of the nodes in this interconnected network. And that was to estimate the expected change in an ego's obesity status if we were to increase by 1 the number of their alters who meet the criteria for obesity. On our estimate, which was on the additive scale here, was exactly 0, so exactly the null value, and it has a pretty narrow confidence interval. We also estimated the causal, a slightly different causal effect, so the causal effect of increasing the average BMI among an ego's alters by half of a standard deviation, which is 2.2 in the units of BMI. And again, we estimated this causal effect to be indistinguishable from zero. So our analyses, which account for network dependence, are not consistent with the presence of pure effects for obesity, but they are consistent with the conjecture that the original paper could have suffered from spurious associations or anti-conservative inference due to overlooking dependence across the nodes in a network. So in conclusion, whenever data are dependent, analyses that treat the data as independent or that fail to fully account for that dependence can underestimate uncertainty. So that means they underestimate standard errors, have p-values that are too small, and have confidence intervals that are too narrow. And they can also produce spurious estimates of associations and of causal effects. And data might be dependent more often than we think. Convenience samples are everywhere in the health and human sciences. Whenever researchers recruit subjects from one or a small number of communities or schools or hospitals. Not to say that every time researchers use a convenience sample, their analysis will be flawed. We actually have no idea how common this is beyond Framingham Heart Study. I forgot to mention, but our test of dependence requires that you know something about the network structure. And that's almost never the case with convenience samples. It's only thanks to the amazing work of Christakis and Fowler to reconstruct the network underlying Framingham Heart Study that we're able to test for dependence in that particular convenience sample. I've primarily focused on how these problems could contribute to the replication crisis in the health and social sciences, but spurious associations are also a problem for any out-of-sample prediction. So this means that machine learning practitioners need to worry about using convenience samples or other kinds of dependent data for as training data. And finally, I'll just close with a plea for more people to work in this area. So statisticians know how to account for lots of kinds of dependence, specifically Euclidean dependence. So dealing with spatial dependence and temporal dependence, that's dependence in Euclidean space of dimensions 1 and 2, and also spatial temporal dependence, so that would be Euclidean distances in 3 dimensions. Those are very active areas of research. But network dependence is non-Euclidean, and dealing with this kind of dependence is really a new frontier in statistics, and adequate methods to account for network dependence in full generality just don't exist yet. So a lot more research is needed in this area. And with that, I would like to thank my collaborators, and Eugen Lee and Oleg Sofragin are the 2 primary co-authors on the work that I presented today. And then this work was funded by the Office of Naval Research Mathematical Data Science Program. Thank you very much.